Welcome to the Dollhouse with Miss Angel, a podcast to discuss girly things for girly boys. I hope you can relax and unwind as my voice takes you on a journey from fashion to flowers. Grab a cup of something warm and let's cuddle up. If you feel sleepy, I'm right here. Now, settle down. Let's get started. And may your thoughts and dreams be as femme as can be. Today, I'm looking at Ladies in Waiting, a book by Anne Somerset. I'll be reading, summarizing, and discussing extracts, focusing mostly on Henry VIII's first two wives and their ladies in waiting. We'll look at the chapter on Henry VIII, a king famous for his many wives and their brutal ends, who kick-started the Protestant Revolution in England, all so he could marry again. On the 23rd of April, 1509, Henry VIII became King of England. Henry VIII's father, on his deathbed, asked his son to marry his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, a woman 5 years older than Henry. Now we understand the context. Let's get a little into the details. So, ladies in waiting were drawn from the highest ranks of the English aristocracy, the majority being not only well married, but of ancient lineage themselves. So could you imagine that? Perhaps in a past life, you too were a courtly maiden. Perhaps that explains why you like the idea of dressing up as one now. Despite their high rank, the duties imposed on these early Tudor ladies in waiting were at times of a very menial nature, and Anne Boleyn, at her coronation banquet, was attended by the Countesses of Oxford and Worcestershire, who, to quote, did hold a fine cloth before the Queen's face, when she list to spit or do otherwise at her pleasure. So, essentially, you may sometimes have been required to assist the Queen. You would be essentially her spittoon, left to clean up her mess and her face if needed. Oftentimes at banquets, people would take a taste of the many dishes. There were so many. And sometimes they would not fully eat what they had been given. So perhaps they would spit out what they didn't like. But the advantages, of course, was that you would be given accommodation, you would get food, you might even get a servant of your own. You were permitted one servant and one spaniel. That's right, you allowed your own courtly dog. Breakfast, ale, and firewood so that your apartments were nice. And with the money that you got, you had to keep yourself well dressed, else you would have been the talk of the court. The advantage of being in the Queen's service as a lady in waiting allowed a woman some sort of career option beyond that of, say, a housekeeper or a wife. Now, what you really want to know about is the various stories of cuckoldry and the various affairs of court. For, as pious as many royals pretended to be, there very much was a lot of, well, double standards to put it mildly. And Henry VIII is well known for his love of women. And not all women had to be married to him. So one famous example is Elizabeth Blount. She was a maid of honour to Catherine of Aragon, and consequently, she had caught the eye of the king, for she was in the queen's service. So whenever he would see the queen in public, she would have her ladies with her. And subsequently, the king began an affair with this pretty girl. Now, we've seen the portraits of Henry VIII, and he was quite a wide man. But when he was younger, he was in better condition, let's just say. He wasn't quite such a block of meat. he hadn't established the dad bod that he became quite famous for. During his affair with Elizabeth, she became pregnant. Now, while that was scandalous for her, it was not for Henry. And while she was discarded, Henry kept the child. He was named Henry Fitzroy and brought up at court, despite being illegitimate, and given a very fine court of his own. So much so that Catherine eventually protested it, that it was too fine for his standing in comparison to her own legitimate child, Mary, who was sired also by the king. But there are other Marys in this story. The king's next foremost mistress, Mary Boleyn, was another lady in waiting at court. She had first worked at the Flemish court before moving to France and then eventually England. Now, when Mary Boleyn moved to England, she was married. But that didn't stop her engaging in an affair with Henry VIII. And to quote Anne Somerset, she was to profit very little from the attachment. Her cuckolded husband remained a comparatively lowly gentleman of the Privy Chamber, not even being knighted in return for his complaisance. And Mary herself was swiftly abandoned by the king. At William Carey, her husband's death in 1528, Mary was left virtually destitute. So while it's very hard to resist the advances of a king if you're in his service, it is fairly obvious when the king has his eye on you. So her husband would have been well aware, also working in court, and consequently turned a blind eye, but received no benefits. He was being cuckolded, and not even bribed for the honor. Foolish man. Now, Mary, being quite abandoned by the king, who took his fancy with her younger sister, Anne, and as I said, she was left destitute, in poverty, despite her relationship with the king. Anne, who had been carefully watching all this, did not wish to be discarded like Henry's previous mistresses. No, she had a different game in mind. And over time, Henry became completely infatuated with Anne Boleyn, much to the chagrin of his wife, the Queen, and possibly his former mistresses. It seems that the ladies in waiting, chosen to be friends of the Queen, seemed to satisfy a secondary role, almost like concubines for the king. Now, to quote Miss Somerset again on Anne Boleyn, the appeal of the woman who thus ensnared the king seems to have depended less on outright beauty, for many observers considered her face, figure, and complexion to be only mediocre, They were all agreed she had very fine black eyes. So yes, Anne Boleyn was not any startling beauty by any stretch of the imagination, but she had charisma. She had a bewitching way about her. And though she had her faults, she was clever at hiding them. But in the end, that bewitching nature of hers would eventually be her downfall. Now, all this time, while Henry was flirting with his various mistresses and chasing the ladies awaiting the Queen herself was quite aware of the whole thing and disapproving, despite being mostly powerless to interfere. And while the King spent much time chasing after Anne, Catherine began to get more offended and ended up spending time in other courtly apartments far away from the scandal. Now, in July 1531, Henry VIII permanently forsook his wife, creeping out of Windsor at dawn, and then sort of shoving her from one royal residence to another, accompanied by all his servants in the scandal. But still there was no divorce, for they were married, and under the Catholic faith at the time, it was considered improper to divorce, and could only be ascertained through permission from the Pope in the Vatican. Aware of this, one of his advisors, Thomas Cromwell, suggested that Henry merely forsake the Vatican too while he was at it. And so he married Anne, despite already being married. And they claimed that the previous marriage should be annulled because she had been married to Henry's brother. And they definitely consummated that first marriage, though Catherine claimed it did not. And during this period of estrangement between the king and his wife, various ladies in waiting were tied up in a conspiracy to spy upon the Queen to see if they could find information that would lead to a successful divorce in the eyes of the church. Once the annulment was formalized, the divorce proceedings arranged by Henry, and Henry had married Anne, who had held out on him as much as she could, until eventually she did sleep with him and became pregnant with child. But upon the birth of her child, another girl, Elizabeth, things began to get a little shaky between Anne and Henry. And Henry's eyes began to rove towards those pretty women that belonged to the entourage of the new queen. But Anne, who was less tolerant and perhaps less aware of the once a cheater, always a cheater maxim, dismissed the lady in question who was alleged to be engaged in unbecoming relations with the king. 2 years later, the first queen, who had been discarded, Catherine, in the forced divorce against her will, so that he could marry Anne, despite the disapproval of the church, she passed away. She died. And it was and her death was a cause of rejoice for both Henry and Anne, showing a sort of bitterness and a sort of malice. I would say neither person was particularly cozy, the sort of person you'd like to bring home and introduce to your parents. Certainly not. But as we all know, Henry never stays loyal for long, and soon his roving eye turned to another little lady in waiting, Jane Seymour, another rather mundane-looking woman, but with a better reputation than Anne. She appealed to the king because she came across as innocent and pure, the utmost figure of modesty, which Anne was not in his eyes. She had been a maid of honour, one of the higher ranking ladies in waiting, to Catherine of Aragon, and her loyalty remained with her. And so there was no love between Anne and Jane Seymour. None at all. And despite Henry's advances, Jane Seymour stayed firm in her refusal. And for that she earned Henry's respect. To quote Anne Somerset again, she was furthermore instructed to poison the king's mind against his wife, Anne, by telling him, in the presence of witnesses upon whom she could rely on to confirm her assertion, how much his subjects abominate the marriage contracted with the concubine, and that no one considers it legitimate. So as you see it, by this point, Catherine, his first wife, in the eyes of the Catholic Church, and in the eyes of most of society, had passed away. Meanwhile, his second wife, Anne, had gradually lost favour with Henry. Both wives had only been able to produce female children. And so Henry was beginning to tire of Anne, and it was easy for him to be swayed by these words. For Anne, in her bitterness and jealousy, was becoming unattractive in his eyes. And everything sort of gradually began to fall to pieces after that for Anne. Those who disliked Anne set against her. It was suggested that she was involved in an incestuous relationship with her brother, and also in witchcraft. And to be condemned for these things was most terrible. And because she had lost favour from most of the people in the court and from the king, there was nobody really willing to defend her. And so people were more than happy to see her put away in the Tower of London. And while she was there in captivity, Anne denied all of the charges, but many of the ladies, who she thought were her friends, were not quite so willing to testify that she hadn't said some inappropriate things about the king, for example. And unfortunately for Anne Boleyn, on the 15th of May 1536, Anne and her brother were tried and executed. She was beheaded. Her and 4 supposed lovers of hers, according to those who accused her of being unfaithful to the king. To quote Anne Somerset again, the king, at least, suffered no misgivings at the fate of his wife, utterly convinced of her guilt, and positive that his former infatuation with her had been the product of witchcraft. Even while Anne was still in the Tower, the court had embarked on a frenzied round of gaiety, with Henry giving feasts for the ladies and staying up till after midnight. So Henry wasn't really too fussed or bothered by the death of his second wife. To put it lightly, he was too busy partying and hanging out with his mistresses and whatever else. Which is really awful when you think about it. My advice to you would be, if you were in the court of Henry VIII, would be to keep your nose down and don't fall for his flirting. Or your head might end up on the chopping the chopping block. So, following this, Henry married Jane Seymour, his third wife. And as we know, she was not his last wife, for following her were another 3 unfortunate women who had caught his roving eye. But in Jane's case, she was neither divorced nor beheaded. Following the birth of a son, who, unfortunately for Henry, died before he could take the throne, Jane herself passed away 12 days after producing her heir. With no queen, many of the ladies of waiting at the time were sent back to the country estates, for they had nobody to serve, until the king would find himself another wife, and the drama would begin again. Rather gloomy reality, but I suppose that's what you expect when you're learning about Henry VIII, of all people. So to clarify, Henry married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, got bored of her, and started flirting with one of her ladies in waiting, who was well renowned for being a bit of a flirt because of her reputation from previous courts. But she held out on him and was all like, divorce your wife or I'm not going to sleep with you. Then eventually she did sleep with him anyway, got pregnant, but still managed to persuade him to divorce his wife, if I get this correct. But in order to divorce his wife, he had to basically sign up to a new religion and completely change the face of British politics, I suppose, for the next several hundred years. If you pay attention to British history, there's a lot of back and forth between Catholics and Protestants and people being executed for being one or the other. Good times. And it still continues on to this day if you have a little nosy at what's going on in Ireland sometimes. Preferably don't. Sometimes I think St. Patrick might have made a mistake about going there. But don't tell them I said that. So while there were a lot of unpleasant things going on, a lot of drama, it certainly was an interesting place to be a part of and to be alive in the time. I mean, could you imagine it? You know, you wake up one day and your father tells you that he's finally got that appointment for you at the court of the Queen, Catherine of Aragon. And you're like, brilliant. That sounds great. I'd love to go live in the court. It's so boring living in the countryside with you. So you go to court and you're having a lovely time, you know, wearing your pretty dresses and making tea. Well, I don't know if they had tea yet. I don't think they did. The tea was later. They found tea later. They got tea later. Drinking wine, I guess. Wine and bitters and beer. You drink your wine and you play with your spaniel, and the Queen calls you to a room and says, "Oh, I want you to be my they attend to my toilet. Hold this bucket. hold this cloth and let me spit at it," or something. Oh, how awful! I would hate that. Now, some of you sissies are probably thinking, "Oh, that sounds marvelous. I would love a beautiful woman to be spitting at me." That's the difference between me and you, okay? I would hate that. So you get past the whole Queen spitting at you, and you start to think, oh, maybe the whole court thing isn't that great. You're minding your business when this rather large gentleman corners you, and he goes, "Oh, you're new here. May I say, you have fabulous ankles." Would you care to join me later for dinner? And you go, I feel like I've seen this chap before. So you go and you ask your friends, some other large chap, um, dressed in white and brown, and he sort of cornered me and invited me to supper. Do you know who he is? Oh, yes, he's the king. Yes, he does that with all the girls. Don't worry about it, it's normal. Try your best to resist. The queen finds out the next day and has you expelled from court for being a whore. To be a lady in waiting in the court of Henry VIII. I think I would take just about anywhere, any other court, maybe. Well, maybe not the Marie Antoinette during the whole French Revolution thing. I don't think I'd like being beheaded for being posh. What do you think? Do you think you would like that? I hope not. Don't think there's many people that fantasize about getting their heads chopped off. But yes, so that was Ladies in Waiting by Anne Somerset. And it did give a very good perspective into the court of Henry VIII and what it meant and what it was like in reality being a lady in waiting. You know, wearing fine things, but also dealing with intrigue and scandal and trying to keep your head out of it. Well, this has been fun and a little bit of an experiment. And if I get some good feedback from this, I will hopefully make more episodes. It was fun for me, and in future I would like to work with other people. I was hoping to bring aboard sissies and cross-dressers that I know as a kind of contrast. So there would be the witchy girl and the boyish girl discussing the same thing and having a look at it. Let me know what you think of that idea. And until next time, my darling.